Welcome to the video for positives and negatives. Um, actually, basically just working with negative numbers in general. There are different ways to think about negative. The You can think about negative in terms of borrowing money. If you owe money, that's negative. If you have money that you can spend, that's positive. Um, I was working with a student from Syria one time, and typically I use temperature. But 0 degree temperature really didn't mean anything to him. So I used the Sea of Galilee, which is below sea level. I talked about hiking up and down, um, above and below sea level. But it's a lot easier to illustrate temperature. And since we live in Colorado, most of us have experienced negative temperatures. Start off with, we're talking about negative numbers in terms of temperature. I want to look at how you would calculate the temperature change. The triangle that you see here and the T stands for temperature. The triangle is the Greek letter delta, means difference. We use delta to mean difference. If I want the difference in temperature, usually it means change. But change we do by taking the difference or subtracting. Most people in the first case would say that between 12 and 1 o'clock, um, it went from 1 to 5 degrees, so the change in temperature is 4 degrees. Pretty straightforward. In the second situation, most people would say, well, it went down from 6 to 3, so it went down 3 degrees. They would take 6 minus 3. And that really requires a very high level of thinking, which is good. But a lot of times we don't want to have to think about things, because if you have to think about something, a computer can't do it. So negative numbers really allow us to do some math without quite as much thinking, which a lot of people seem to like sometimes, but that's a different story. I'm going to say the change in temperature is 3 minus 6. Just like before, I took the new temperature, subtracted the old temperature, and my temperature change is negative 3. Point of this is that there are really two ways we can represent negative in terms of temperatures. Negative can be temperatures that are below 0, or it can be a change in temperature where the atmosphere gets colder. So now that we know what delta T, change in temperature, means, we're going to go through a couple of exercises here. So now we have a change in temperature, delta T of 5 degrees. What's the new temperature? Well, it was at 1. It's going to go up to 6. And that represents 1 plus 5 equals 6. And that's what we're used to from elementary school. No big deal there. But if the temperature goes up 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees here, I start at negative 3, I add 5, I end up at 2. So when we have a negative and a positive, we add them together. It really depends on which one's bigger. But we could also think of this as 5 plus negative 3 is 2, which is where we get the idea that adding a negative is the same as subtracting a positive. Now I have a change in temperature of negative 4, so it's going down. I go from 5 down to 1. 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 . 1 And I really represent as 5 plus -4, because my temperature change is negative. I add the change and I get 1 degree. In the second case, where it's 2 degrees at 12 o'clock, it goes down 4. I'm actually going to end up at -2. So 2 plus -2, 2 plus -4 equals -2 degrees. So when you're adding negatives, whether the answer is positive or negative really depends. We can't just say we add a positive and negative, the answer is going to be negative or positive. When we're adding, we really have to think about which one of the numbers is further away from 0, because in this case, -4 was not enough to get us back to 0. In this case, it took us back to 0 and then kept going. So we really have to think about that when we're adding negatives. Now we're talking about what happened before. So here I had a temperature at 12 o'clock. I added -3, and my answer was 2. To figure out what that was, I have to take away that negative. And yes, if we had 5 degrees and a negative temperature change of 3, it would end up at 2. So if I do 2 and I take away my -3, that gets me back to my 5. That's where we get the idea that I don't like it, but I often heard keep change. So subtracting a -3, we change it to adding a +3, and we get 5 degrees. And if I'm at -4, I take away that negative, take away the -3 degrees, I end up at -1 degree. So I'm still doing -4 plus +3. If I'm at 4 and I go back up 3, I'm at -1 degree. So if we are adding or subtracting negative numbers, it's always a good option to change it back to addition. Subtracting a negative, we add a positive. Adding a negative, we can subtract a positive. And if we think about it, my -3, I would have started at -1. If I'm going to go down 3 and end up at 4. So if we look at when we're adding, if we add a positive and a positive, that's just like what we've always done. We're going to end up with a positive. If we add a negative and a negative, we have a negative number, we add another negative. I'm not talking about subtracting a negative here. So we have -5, we add -3, we get -8. So if they're both negative, when I add them together, it's going to be even more negative. The answer is going to be more negative, or further down in the negative numbers. If I add a positive and a negative, it really depends. Whether the answer is positive or negative depends on which is bigger. And we say bigger because we're talking about really the absolute value of the number. If you add a -7 and a +2, +2 is actually greater than the -7. All positive numbers are greater than negative numbers. But the -7 has more absolute value. It's further from 0. And when we subtract, if we subtract two positive numbers, whether the answer is positive or negative really depends on which number is bigger. If the first number is bigger, your answer is positive. If the second number is bigger, initially in elementary school, we're told we can't do that. But we eventually find out that we can do it. We just get a negative number. If we have a positive and we subtract a negative, subtracting a negative is like adding a positive. That's going to give us a positive answer. And we have a negative, we subtract a positive. Subtracting a positive makes it go down. If we're already negative, we go down more. Our answer is going to be negative. If we have a negative and we're subtracting a negative is like adding a positive. So we really have a negative plus a positive. It depends on which one's bigger as to whether the answer is positive or negative. So you really have to think about it when you're adding. I want to talk real quickly about multiplication. Multiplication, in this case, we're going to have a change in temperature of 2 degrees, and we're asking the question, what will the temperature be in 3 hours? So we're going to add 3 2's together. So we go up 2 degrees. We go up 2 more degrees. And then we go up 2 more degrees. So 2 times 3 is 6. And apart from the parentheses, that's just what we remember from elementary school. But now we can think about, now I have 3 hours. The temperature is going down 2 degrees every hour. In 3 hours, it will be 3 times -2. And if we think about it, we go down 2, we go down 2, and we go down 2. So 3 times a -2 is going to be -6. So positive times a negative is -6, or is a negative number. Now I have another situation. I've got a temperature change of 2 degrees. The temperature is going up 2 degrees every hour. But now I'm being asked the question, what was the temperature 3 hours ago? Well, if it came up, it had to be lower. So if it's coming up 2 degrees every hour, so now I can say, instead of 3 times -2, I have -3 times +2, and that's going to give me the -6 as well. So a negative times a positive is a negative times a negative is a negative. But now we actually have a method for figuring out a negative times a negative. Now we have a -2 degree temperature change. It's going to go down 2 degrees every hour. The question now is, what was the temperature 3 hours ago? So now we have -3 times -2. If we're going down, then we had to come down to get to 0. If the temperature's going down, an hour ago it had to be 2 degrees more. Before that it had to be 2 degrees more. So if I do -3 times -2, I'm going to end up with a +6. So when we summarize our multiplication, positive times a positive, just like elementary school, that's going to give us a positive. No change there. Positive times a negative is going to give us a negative. Negative times a positive is going to give us a negative. And a negative times a negative gives us a positive. It doesn't matter how big either number is. And this is actually, a lot of people, only thing they remember from school math class is two negatives make a positive. Well, when you add, 2 negatives make a negative. When you multiply, 2 negatives make a positive. So don't memorize 2 negatives make a positive. Memorize when you multiply 2 negatives, the answer is positive. And then you'll also have to remember when you add 2 negatives, the answer is negative. Well, please do that. And don't say 2 negatives make a positive. In terms of division, you can kind of play around with it, but since division is the opposite of multiplication, we find that division comes out about the same as multiplication. If you divide 2 negatives, the answer is positive. If you divide a negative and a positive, the answer is negative. Positive and a negative, the answer is negative. And there was a question about fractions in one of the assignments. 1 over -2 is the same as -1/2. It's the same as -1/2. Doesn't matter where the negative goes, because when you divide, as long as there's 1 negative, the answer is negative. If there's 2 negatives, the answer is positive.